October 29, 1929, New York City. It is 10 in the morning. The New York Stock Exchange opens for trading. Within minutes, something is wrong. The sell orders are coming in faster than the machines can process them. The ticker tape falls hours behind. Traders are screaming. Men are running. The floor of the most powerful financial institution on earth looks like it is on fire. By the end of that single day, 16 million shares have been traded. Billions of dollars have evaporated. Thousands of investors have been wiped out completely. Men who woke up wealthy that morning go home with nothing. They call it Black Tuesday. But Black Tuesday was not the disaster. Black Tuesday was just the beginning. What came after was something the world had never seen before and has never fully recovered from since. A decade of suffering so vast and so deep that it reshaped every government, every economy, and every ordinary life it touched. 25% of every working American lost their job. Not laid off temporarily, gone. 15 million people with no income, no savings, no safety net, and no government willing to help them. Children begged at the doors of neighbors for stale bread and potato peelings. Families lived in cardboard shacks on the edges of cities they named after the president who refused to save them. In 1931 alone, there were at least 20 documented cases of starvation in the richest country on earth. And the men responsible? The bankers who built the house of cards, the politicians who watched it burn, the government officials who made it worse when they had the power to make it better. Every single one of them kept their homes, their wealth, their power. This is the story of the Great Depression and the people who caused it. To understand how it happened, you have to understand what came before it. The 1920s in America were extraordinary. The Roaring Twenties, jazz music, flappers, automobiles, the first radio broadcasts, the first commercial airlines, a country that had survived the horror of World War I and emerged as the most powerful economy on earth, drunk on its own success and convinced the party would never end. Between 1922 and 1929, the American economy grew at nearly 5% every year. The Dow Jones Industrial Average rose six-fold in 8 years, from 63 points in 1921 to 381 points by September 1929. Everyone wanted a piece of it. Not just the wealthy, not just Wall Street professionals, ordinary people, factory workers, farmers, teachers, cooks, chauffeurs. Everyone was buying stocks. Everyone was getting rich, or so it seemed. The problem was how they were buying. Margin buying. You could purchase stocks by putting down as little as 10% of the actual price and borrowing the rest from your broker. If the stock went up, you made enormous profits. If the stock went down, your broker demanded immediate payment of the full loan. By the summer of 1929, 300 million shares of stock were being carried on borrowed money. The entire American boom was built on debt. And the people who should have known better, the bankers, the politicians, the financial regulators, did nothing. Because they were getting rich too. There were warnings. There were always warnings. Economist Roger Babson stood up in September 1929 and said publicly that a crash is coming and it will be terrific. Wall Street laughed at him. Respected economist Irving Fisher, days before the crash, declared that stock prices have reached what looks like a permanently high plateau. Nobody wanted to hear that the music was about to stop, so nobody listened. The crash did not happen in a single day. It happened over a series of days in late October 1929 that history remembers as Black Thursday, Black Monday, and Black Tuesday. Each day worse than the last, each day more money gone, more investors destroyed, more lives changed forever. On Black Thursday, October 24th, a record 12.9 million shares were traded in a single day. Panic was visible on every face on the trading floor. A group of powerful bankers pooled their money and bought huge blocks of stock to try to stop the bleeding. It worked temporarily. The market steadied. People went home thinking the worst was over. It was not over. On Black Monday, October 28th, the market dropped 12.8% in a single day. Margin calls went out across the country. Investors who had borrowed to buy stocks were told to pay immediately. They could not pay, so they sold everything, which pushed prices lower, which triggered more margin calls, which forced more selling. A death spiral with no bottom in sight. Then came Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929. 16.4 million shares traded in a single day. The ticker machines could not keep up. Brokers had no idea what prices they were actually trading at. Men stood on the floor of the exchange, screaming into a void. Around $14 billion of stock value disappeared in a single afternoon. A man named Walter Thornton tried to sell his luxury car on the streets of New York for $100 cash. He needed the money that morning. By afternoon, it was gone. Outside on Wall Street, a crowd gathered watching the chaos unfold inside. A rumor spread that men were jumping from buildings. Police were sent to investigate. The rumor was not true. Not yet. But the real disaster was not the crash itself. The real disaster was what the men in power chose to do next. Here is what most people do not know about the Great Depression. The crash of October 1929 was severe, but it did not have to become the Great Depression. Economic downturns happen. Markets fall, they recover. That's the cycle. What turned a serious recession into the greatest economic catastrophe in modern history was a series of deliberate decisions made by the most powerful bankers and politicians in America. Decisions that made everything worse. The Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States, the institution with the power and responsibility to stabilize the financial system in a crisis. When the crash happened, the Federal Reserve had a choice. They could inject money into the banking system, lower interest rates, make credit available, prevent the cascade of bank failures that was beginning. They did the opposite. The Federal Reserve raised interest rates during an economy collapsing. They tightened credit when the entire system needed liquidity. They watched bank after bank fail and did almost nothing to stop it. Between 1930 and 1932, over 9,000 American banks failed. 9,000 banks, each one taking the savings of thousands of ordinary people with them into oblivion. People who had never gambled in the stock market, people who had simply worked and saved and trusted that their money was safe. It was not safe. And the men running the Federal Reserve knew what they were doing. This was not incompetence. The records show they debated these decisions. They understood the consequences. They chose contraction over expansion, sound money over saving people. Then there was President Herbert Hoover. Hoover was not a stupid man. He was an engineer, methodical, organized, a man who had managed enormous logistical challenges throughout his career. But he had a philosophy. Rugged individualism, the idea that government should not interfere in the lives of citizens, that people should solve their own problems, that the market would correct itself if left alone. That philosophy, applied to the worst economic crisis in American history, was catastrophic. When the unemployed came to Washington asking for help, Hoover told them to be patient. Things would improve. When states begged for federal relief funds, Hoover refused. When economists pleaded with him to stimulate spending, he insisted on balancing the budget. While Americans were starving, Hoover was worried about the federal deficit. In New York City alone, by the end of 1932, over 85,000 meals were being served daily in breadlines and soup kitchens just to keep people alive. There were 82 breadlines in New York City. 82! Shanty towns of cardboard and corrugated metal sprung up across every American city. People named them Hoovervilles. In one of the most painful acts of public sarcasm in American history, the homeless named their neighborhoods after the president who refused to see them. The newspapers they wrapped around themselves at night to stay warm, they called Hoover blankets. One survivor of the Depression, speaking decades later, described what hunger actually felt like after the first few days. "You get used to it," she said. "After the first few days, it does not even hurt anymore. You just get weak." Children in coastal cities roamed the docks looking for spoiled vegetables. Children in the richest country on earth looking for rotting food to bring home to their families. In 1931, 20 Americans died of documented starvation. By 1934, that number had grown to 110. These are only the documented cases. The real number was certainly higher. Meanwhile, on Wall Street, something extraordinary was happening. While ordinary Americans were starving and losing their homes and their savings, some of the wealthiest bankers in America were getting richer. Albert Wiggin, the president of Chase National Bank, one of the most powerful financial institutions in America, had secretly been betting against his own bank's stock, profiting from the very collapse he was supposed to prevent, making millions as Chase failed and his employees lost their jobs and their savings. He was not alone. Senate investigations in the early 1930s revealed that the heads of the largest banks in America had been engaging in practices of extraordinary cynicism, paying themselves enormous bonuses while their banks failed, selling stock to family members at preferential prices before bad news became public, manipulating markets for personal profit while their customers lost everything. Not a single one of them went to prison. And while this was happening, while ordinary Americans were watching their world dissolve, the political response was breathtaking in its callousness. In 1932, a group of World War I veterans marched to Washington. They had been promised bonuses for their service, payments that were not due until 1945. But they needed the money now. They were hungry. Their families were hungry. They marched in their old uniforms, many of them with medals still pinned to their chests, and set up a camp across from the Capitol building. 20,000 veterans, men who had fought for their country, asking their country for help. Hoover sent the army. General Douglas MacArthur, with tanks and cavalry and fixed bayonets, drove the veterans from their camp. Tear gas was used. Several veterans were injured. The makeshift shelters were burned to the ground. Americans watched newsreel footage of their government using military force against its own veterans, men who had given years of their lives to this country, standing in their old uniforms, being driven away with tear gas and fire. The outrage was total. By 1932, the numbers were almost impossible to comprehend. 25% unemployment, 12.8 million people with no work. Wages for those lucky enough to still have jobs had fallen 42% since 1929. Nearly 90,000 businesses had permanently closed. Farm prices had fallen so drastically that farmers could not cover the cost of growing their crops. They plowed their harvests back into the ground because selling them would cost more than leaving them to rot. In the Great Plains, a drought had turned millions of acres of farmland into a dust bowl. Walls of black dirt, hundreds of feet high, rolled across Oklahoma and Texas and Kansas, burying farms and towns and everything in their path. Hundreds of thousands of families loaded everything they owned onto trucks and drove west toward California, desperately hoping for work that often did not exist when they arrived. These were not lazy people. These were not weak people. These were farmers who had worked the same land for generations, workers who had given everything to companies that discarded them without hesitation, parents who had done everything right and still could not feed their children. They had not made a single mistake. The mistakes had been made in boardrooms and in Washington by men who paid no price for any of it. In November 1932, the American people made their verdict clear. They elected Franklin Delano Roosevelt as president in a landslide of historic proportions. Hoover, the man who told them to be patient and take care of themselves while they starved, won only 6 states. Roosevelt took office on March 4, 1933, with the banking system on the edge of total collapse, unemployment at 25%, the country in the deepest despair it had ever known. He did something no president before him had been willing to do. He acted. Within his first 100 days, Roosevelt pushed through Congress a package of legislation that would permanently change the relationship between the American government and its people. The New Deal, bank reforms, agricultural support, public works programs that put millions of people back to work, unemployment insurance, Social Security, a safety net that had never existed before. Was the New Deal perfect? No. Did it end the Depression immediately? No. The Depression would linger until the beginning of World War II, but it changed something fundamental. It proved that government had a responsibility to its people in times of crisis, not to lecture them about rugged individualism while they starved, not to send the army against veterans asking for help, but to act decisively on the side of ordinary people. Here is what I need you to sit with. The Great Depression did not have to happen the way it happened. The crash of 1929 was severe, but the decisions made in the months and years that followed by the Federal Reserve, by the banks, by Herbert Hoover and his administration turned a crisis into a catastrophe. They chose ideology over people. They chose the gold standard over employment. They chose balanced budgets over children who were starving. And when veterans came to Washington in their old uniforms asking for help, they sent tanks. 25% unemployment, 110 starvation deaths in a single year, 9,000 banks failed, 90,000 businesses closed, millions of families homeless. None of this was inevitable. All of it was a choice. And the men who made those choices, the bankers who bet against their own institutions while their customers lost everything, the Federal Reserve officials who raised interest rates during a collapsing economy, the president who told starving people to take care of themselves while billions went to banks, none of them missed a single meal. Remember that the next time someone tells you that economic suffering is simply the natural consequence of market forces. Markets do not make decisions. People do, and people can be held responsible, or they can be allowed to walk away. History tells us which one usually happens, and history is still waiting to be proven wrong.